DNA of the soul.
Welcome, I'm your host Kenny, and you're listening to Social Sleuth. You know the drill, we're back to yap. Today, I am joined by Matthew Facciani, a social science researcher studying information systems, media literacy, and how people interact with AI. We discuss social identity, media literacy, and all things misinformation. Certainly another impactful convo in the Social Sleuth books.
Drum roll, please. Can anybody guess?
Welcome, Matthew. Thanks for coming on Social Sleuth. To start out, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, so hello everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me on your show. My name is Matthew Facciani. I am a social scientist and I work at the University of Notre Dame where I study information systems and media literacy and how people interact with artificial intelligence.
To jump right into it, I've been reading some of your content that you've made and some of your publications. I'm really intrigued by this idea of power of identity and social identity complex. Could you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, sure. So as a social scientist studying information systems and how people process information, I approach it from a way of how do social factors influence how we evaluate information. So that's kind of like big picture what I study. And I often study that in terms of social identities. So social identities are just these set of meanings that are associated with some role we have or some group we belong to, or even just how we see ourselves as unique individuals. So one easy example that I often bring up is like if we are a sports fan. So if we just identify with a group that we like this particular sports team, we want to cheer for that group, it gives us a sense of community sometimes. It maybe allows us to feel good when the team wins, whenever we associate with them. And it can even change how we process information. If we're watching a game on TV, we might be biased to think that a referee call was unfair if it goes against our team. And that can be pretty benign for the most part, not have a big impact. But that same process of identity and biased information processing can make a big difference when we consider things like political identities or religious identities, where we might have a motivation to interpret factual information in a way that's less objective whenever that factual information conflicts with our own political or religious identity. So that's kind of like big picture how identities influence us. And then there's this whole literature on how the types of networks that we have can contribute to those identities and the strength of those identities. And you mentioned this idea of social identity complexity, which is basically how independent all of our identities are from each other. And ideally, we'd want to have greater social identity complexity, which means we have lots of different identities that are independent from each other. And this allows us to be more open-minded, more objective when we process information, because we're not viewing the world through such a narrow lens of identities where all of our meanings are overlapping with each other. So again, one extreme example could be if we have a political identity and a religious identity and a friend identity, and all of those completely overlap in a perfect circle. So all of our friends are from the same church, our political and religious identity completely overlap 100%, and everything is viewed through this narrow lens of meanings, this handful of meanings that all represent those crucial identities that we have. And that would create a lot of bias because we're so motivated to protect that set of meanings that comprises how we see ourselves, that any information that challenges it can feel very personally threatening. So in contrast, if we have a diverse set of identities where maybe we have a religious and political identity, but they don't overlap as much, and we have friends from people of all different types of backgrounds, then we're not so dependent on deriving our self-esteem from this narrow set of identities, and we're more able to process information more objectively and less susceptible to misinformation.
That's a really good sort of broad thing. It kind of makes me think, I guess to be forthcoming, I have a sociology undergrad, so I'm kind of thinking in similar ways. Obviously, you have a more interdisciplinary lens looking at it. But if this is looking at social networks, what about things like intersectionality that are more interpersonal as far as like overlapping of groups? Is that
Mm-hmm.
something that is outside of this conversation or sort of placed in the center when we're thinking about this complexity?
It certainly can be. So there's a couple ways to approach it. Um, One way that I think about is this overarching idea of we want to increase diversity of our networks to reduce political polarization and political bias. So that's something that I found and other researchers have found this high level finding of greater diversity of networks reduces bias. But it gets really complicated whenever we're thinking about what specific identities are involved. So, for example, if you belong to a certain marginalized group and certain political policies are directly affecting you because of that particular identity, then you may not want to associate with certain people who challenge your political beliefs because they're so personal to you. And indeed, this is some research we found after the 2016 election. We found that LGBT Americans were more likely to cut ties with people who disagreed with their politics after the 2016 election than their cisgender heterosexual counterparts. So the idea was that not only is it tough to remain friends with people who disagree with you politically, it's especially tough if you feel like these policies are directly impacting you. So that kind of adds a layer of complexity to just adding diversity. Sometimes it can be challenging to do that.
And then so we're talking about social identity complex and the power of identity in relation to misinformation. When you're speaking of misinformation, could you sort of define what you're looking at?
Yeah, so misinformation broadly is just false or misleading information regardless of intent. So it's a super broad umbrella term. It can mean lots of different things, lots of different topics. And for me, I try to approach it from very concrete examples of things that are not factual. So, like a completely fabricated news headline, for example. And this is something that I found in a previous research study I did where the misinformation we had was completely made up stories that we saw on social media. So one would be like there was one example of it was like most uh, liberal activists are unemployed and live with their parents. So that was something that we saw. So that was an attack on liberal folks. And then we had a attack on conservative leaders such as Donald Trump Jr. There was this headline of Donald Trump Jr. has the most left swipes on Tinder, like attacking him and making fun of him. So these were both just like completely made up stories that were trending on social media and have a partisan bias. So we looked at Democrats and Republicans, and we found that when Democrats and Republicans had completely homogeneous political networks, meaning like everyone in their personal network shared their attitudes, their political attitudes, they were more likely to believe and share those headlines that were completely made up. So this speaks to this idea of if your social identity is really important to you, because we also found that not only is it this completely homogeneous effect of personal network structure, meaning all of the people you list that you're close with share your politics. But also, if you say your political identity is very important to you, then you're also more likely to believe these rumors and these false news headlines. So we also included these political rumors, such as like reading these stories about a Democrat bullying someone or a Republican bullying someone. And again, we found these identity forces predicted people more likely to believe and share these fabricated stories.
Interesting. Sorry, I'm trying not to giggle at the examples because obviously it's serious things. People are believing them and sharing them.
Sure.
And like I had mentioned sort of before we started recording, with a Canadian perspective, I feel like that adds a layer of outside of not seeing it as well for myself of reinforcing my identity with either of those examples.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of brings into media literacy and sort of being able to see well, would anybody, is that really a newsworthy story of swiping left however many swipes, and what's sort of the motive behind that.
Right.
And when I was looking at your work and looking into media literacy, I had done some digging because I thought that I did this in elementary school or middle school and throughout my K to 12. And where I live, it's been going on for about 2 decades or so, with some research showing that it needs to get better. But how is media literacy sort of taught if you have an understanding within the education system in the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the details exactly. I know it's not emphasized as much as other countries, so it may be less than Canada. I know it's certainly less than Finland. Finland has a really robust public education system that focuses on media literacy very directly. And I know certain states are now requiring it more. So I think it was just New York State that implemented this emphasis on media literacy in schools. But I don't think it's statewide. Like every state has the same curriculums. And it is really important. I mean, of course, I'm biased as someone who studies media literacy and AI literacy, but I think those are really important components for the future. I think everyone should try to increase their media literacy, and it's basically just empowering people to be able to critically evaluate information. It's something that should be nonpartisan, and there's a lot of nonpartisan support for this, or bipartisan support in the US, where both Democrats and Republicans agree that media literacy is a good thing and more people should have it. So hopefully we can continue that trend of teaching media literacy skills early on and also throughout adulthood too. There's certainly it's a lot of room for improvement for older adults now who never had those media literacy classes. So it would be great to try to reach them with different resources now. And there are some programs that do that and some online resources that can help. There's some creative ways to try to do this with online games that teach media literacy that can be very scalable and reach a bunch of people very quickly. But it's still a challenge to actually get media literacy to people who need it most.
I think I'm glad you brought that up as well, because you were speaking of AI as well, which I think is something that I try to reject that is coming in whether I like it or not, with older adults and people. Even myself, I'm not an older adult, but not growing up with it. And it's so novel, and maybe it's not going to influence you at the polls, but maybe make you believe things, that you've seen things that don't exist. And that's important. Kind of out of this idea of misinformation, but more so forbidden knowledge, sort of a concept that I've taken out of some of your other work in looking into you and seeing it as a building block of conspiracy or sort of a manipulation of censorship from what I was getting. Could you add to that?
Yeah, so one paper that I worked on looked at this concept of forbidden knowledge. So this idea of something is being censored or removed from a social media website, and they're trying to take it away from you. The they being intentionally vague, and there's some kind of force that's removing you from accessing this information, making it forbidden. So you might have seen framing like this just on like news articles or even like advertisements. It's like doctors don't want you to know this trick or something like that. And that's the idea behind it. We were curious if that framing specifically makes the information more attractive to people and if they're more likely to want to click on it and learn about it. And we did find that. So basically, we used examples from COVID-19. Data was collected during the height of the pandemic. There was a lot of discussion on like alternative treatments and whether or not vaccines were safe. And basically, the censorship or forbidden knowledge was reading about alternative treatments for COVID-19 that were being censored or forbidden knowledge. And we found that conservatives and Republicans in the United States were more likely to want to learn about these statements or these news articles they read if there was some forbidden knowledge framing around them. So if you read about some COVID-19 alternative treatment and it's just presented to you as some neutral frame of just like there is a treatment available, an alternative treatment, and you just read that statement versus they don't want you to know about this alternative treatment, making it this more forbidden knowledge framing. We found that people were more likely to want to learn more about that forbidden knowledge statement than the neutral frame. So the larger issue is if we try to censor or if we try to restrict speech that people are interested in, it actually might make them more likely to want to check it out and more likely to seek it because they think that there's something true to it, and that's why these forces are trying to restrict it. Of course, with that study, we just looked at the conservative angle, so future work could look at if liberals have the same effect. I would imagine that they do. I do think this idea of censorship and forbidden knowledge can make the information seem more attractive, especially in this very polarized climate that we have in the US. That if you believe one group, the group you don't like is trying to restrict it from you, I think it makes you more likely to want to click on it and understand it. So that's the broader idea behind this forbidden knowledge, but it's still a new concept and definitely a lot of room for future work to study.
I found it really interesting, just sort of that curiosity and how we can reframe using language. Um, and sort of one of my more favorite areas of research into rhetoric of like health and how we frame that. But I think it's important how you were looking at misinformation and this idea of digital literacy as a way to sort of strip the political side of it and really just get people to a more mellow sort of state where we can actually talk and work through things and have a more positive outlook. And we're all just pitted against each other. It's really hard to actually do that. I wonder with media literacy is sort of the push of this could be a really good way to level this playing field of how you sort of feel about censorship, even if it's outside of the scope of your current research, but how that can sort of play. I think a lot of trust can be swayed with transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of, at least in Canada, I can speak to, I feel like a lot of more conspiratorial or misinformation or disinformation, maybe not exactly incorrect, but sort of iffy and sort of can lead people to different conclusions, was through COVID-19 and sort of the delay in information. So it wasn't that the information wasn't coming, but people were panicked and there was a lot of fear, so they were jumping to things before it was given to them. And so a lot of trust was sort of disturbed in that way. And I wonder if censorship being sort of hidden and not as transparent in a lot of ways sort of feeds into this. Sorry, that was long-winded and off track, but how censorship and those sorts of regulations or content moderation kind of builds into this greater conversation of misinformation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of overlap. It can be very counterproductive to try to take this sledgehammer approach to content moderation and trying to very clumsily label things, even as misinformation, or certainly censoring people from speaking on these platforms. It can make them just go to other sources and become more mistrustful of the technology company, and then if the technology company was having any conversations with the government, depending on even what those conversations were, it's just there's some link there where people distrust the government too. So I definitely fall more on the side of having more speech and more freedom of expression. I think that's a healthy way to go about the information space. I often think it's counterproductive to try to go around mitigating speech or censoring. Um, People just find alternative ways to do it. So it's it's unfortunate that there's sometimes people think that like fact checking is some type of censorship in itself, because I think those terms are conflated sometimes in the current discourse. Fact checking to me and media literacy and all these types of things should be considered more speech. It's not trying to restrict speech. So I certainly have disagreed with a lot of like Meta, for example, a lot of their very heavy-handed decision making on what to restrict on their platform, I think can be counterproductive. Um, and it can reduce trust. And then more broadly to that, the messaging I think is really important when we think about these institutions. So like with COVID-19, in the United States, there was this really big issue of the inconsistent messaging at the beginning of the pandemic, where we had our public health officials saying, do not wear masks. Masks should not be worn at the beginning, and we need to. They didn't even say why. It's just like, you don't need to wear masks. And then very quickly after that, they say you absolutely need to wear masks. And then we try to impose different mandates at different state levels and different city levels. And that alone creates a lot of distrust. When you have a very strong, direct, yes, you should do this, or no, you should do this, then you immediately flip it. So messaging was something that I wish was given more thought during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it would have made a big difference as far as trust and trustworthiness. There were other political factors as well that made it difficult. Again, in the United States, it's such a polarized country politically that it's like every issue now seems like it can be politically polarized, unfortunately. And we saw that with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there was some research showing that the United States was unique in just how polarized it was compared to other countries. I think Canada still had some polarization between the left and the right.
Definitely a bit, but I wouldn't
Yeah.
say to the same degree. It wasn't as it didn't have as much historical tie to it, I guess. It was sort of more of a new and emerging rather than a reinforcement
Mm-hmm.
of polarization. Maybe that is prescribing that onto the US
Mm-hmm.
of it was already polarized, and this sort of showcased that, versus I think Canada was much more neutral, and people had different political orientations and different value systems, but it wasn't a us versus them or an in-group and an out-group. It was
Mm-hmm.
more like, yeah, this is my friend and they have a different idea and that's okay. And then we move forward, and then we see sort of the, I guess, like these linking pieces and sort of connotations to different things, and things are being assigned to one side of the political
Mm-hmm.
spectrum, even though we don't have a two-party system. Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of look back and wish that we did things differently and that we had sort of the tools to do that. But I did
Yeah.
like your comment about content moderation and fact checking versus censorship. And I would agree that they often do get crossed over a lot, and that's not very productive. When I think of censorship, I think of something as being completely blocked from being viewed by anybody, versus you can have free speech and put something out there, but that doesn't mean that other people also don't have that right to comment and sort of point out maybe flaws or have critiques and those sorts of things.
Right.
And we forget that that right also comes with the responsibility to be able to handle the discourse that you're creating. And that sort of falls, you also mentioned a couple seconds ago about sort of the messy or clumsy application of misinformation. And I think I see that as something that can be sort of detrimental to this idea of what actual misinformation is. If we're throwing it on everything, then it's like, well, what actually is the problem and where should we be putting our strengths to?
Right.
It waters it down in a way. And I think of this with memes, something that are usually comedic in nature and fairly casual between people just sort of expressing, much like a political cartoon in a lot of ways. And at least, I don't know if it's everywhere that they're getting these claims or if it's a regional sort of thing, but political memes getting a misinformation sticker on top or the banner on the bottom, when it was never, I don't think that with proper media literacy training, when you're looking at an image that has the white box and the text, and you can clearly see that it's not newsworthy, this isn't trying to be portrayed as fact, to have that label on it, I wonder one of two things: if this goes into forbidden knowledge and is trying to intrigue people in with this sort of claim, even though it's not necessarily a content creator that is choosing to have that on there, but it kind of helps them in that way. Or if it's giving too much credit to these memes as being influential as things that people are gaining knowledge from or getting their news sources from and things like that. So I find it interesting if we would give attention to more comedic or satirical things. And is that something you think is important? Am I reading them too much of a joke and we should be giving attention to it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Yeah. I mean, memes are definitely a very powerful way to communicate to your own group and to other groups, and they can spread very quickly, very widely on social media. So I think it's important to study them for sure. Um, yeah, I don't really agree with labeling them. Again, it's like trying to think like what's the goal of labeling a meme as political misinformation, for example. Like the people who already want to agree with what's in that meme are not going to pay attention to that label, and in fact it could embolden them. So if your goal is to get people to think more thoughtfully about it, you're kind of preventing them from going that direction by creating this extra issue of some top down approach to content moderation And it's why I tend to be more neutral on even the old school style of fact checking on social media versus the new community notes style. It's a bit uncertain, from my understanding, which approach is actually going to be better. As far as like, if you want people to get good information, um, the community notes can be very helpful in some ways. But the broader issue is like fact checking is so after the fact and has such a small impact anyway. It doesn't really matter that much as far as whether or not it's traditional fact checking of like some independent label is placed on this versus a community note. Because the big issue with misinformation and disinformation online is it spreads so quickly and so widely before any fact check is even applied on it. And so many more people see that false information than who would see the fact check. So I think it's good to have some sort of fact check that people can see if they're interested in. But those who are already biased to believe what's in that false information are not going to be swayed by any type of fact check. So I don't know if that exactly gets to your point about memes and things like that. But I think it just becomes really challenging when we evaluate the pros and cons of putting these labels on misinformation from a top-down approach instead of a more bottom-up, community-driven approach. I think there's a lot of nuance there as far as what the net impact is, because we know that there's tons of research showing in survey experiments that if you show someone these false headlines, then you say, hey, this was fact-checked by this third party, do you believe it's true or not? People are more likely to say, oh, well, if this third party said it was false, then I tend to agree with that. But that's like very artificial. And in the real world, it becomes a lot messier as far as what that impact looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, kind of around my question that was not fully formed, so I don't know if it would even be possible to answer it. That's just something I think about often, and sort of how that priority piece. And I think sort of taking from what you're saying, if we're using more of a community-based approach, people can choose what that priority is and where we see it, maybe challenges or soft spots, versus a top-down algorithm or maybe even AI using things to filter out when it's not necessarily maybe able to grasp the intent or the believability of it. Because to your point of misinformation is just false or inaccurate information, regardless of intent. But then if we look at media literacy and people are able to go, hey, this is a joke, this is coming from this account, they're not a reliable source for news, I know that I'm getting something silly out of this, or a laugh out of this, or maybe a way to think differently about something in a more casual sense. I'd seen an image that you had shared in my sleuthing, and it was the umbrella with media literacy and sort of all of the pockets underneath the different ways that you can do that and what sort of things to think about. And then funding as a motivation, maybe not that exact wording, was sort of one of those. And I think that is important to think of who's either paying for this, who's buying it, what money is changing hands. And I wonder if that is both good for legitimizing good sources and sort of things we can trust, but also builds into skepticism. And if that's something that you've looked into or sort of thought about.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. So one of the practices of media literacy that's discussed is, looking at the source and who's behind that source, both the author themselves, like what do they typically cover, what are their potential biases, but then the larger funding structure, what are the incentive structure. So ideally, we'd want to have some sort of media organization that's independent of some political influence, and their funding is from some independent source or a series of more independent sources where they're not so beholden to a particular narrative. And that's really one way to approach it. In fact, there's other work looking at what's called like value checking or narrative checking instead of fact checking. So even beyond the focusing so much on whether a statement is true or false, you look at the bigger picture of who's writing this and what are their values, what are their goals. And I think that's a very helpful way to go about it. And that's something that I would stress for people who are interested in trying to increase their own media literacy is not only verify the claims of that article that you're reading, but try to look at the broader credibility of the person making those claims and the company that they work for. And if some media outlet is funded exclusively by some very strong political group that has very strong ideological positions, then we can say that warrants some skepticism, compared to if there is a nonprofit that has maybe a bunch of independent funders that are not so beholden to some specific political ideology. Then maybe we can increase our trust towards what their goals are. Again, it's not perfect. There's always going to be examples of exceptions and stuff like that, but we really should be mindful of where that funding is coming from and what is that economic incentive for the content they're creating and why they might specifically focus on one angle of the story as opposed to another.
Yeah, sort of the framing of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something also too that I guess maybe more of a privileged point of learning about social science and sort of research methods and how we're doing these things and how to read statistics is that you're able to sort of look at how things can be framed in so many different ways, both positively and ethically, but also can be swayed outside of sort of standards for statistics. And I think that brings in like another level of caution or skepticism, but even just critical thinking over it. And that's a really good point to bring up if that's not your everyday life or not something that you're necessarily drawn to learn about. You should know about it at least in a more general sense to have a more, not an easier time, but a better time consuming digital content. That's kind of all of my questions. I wonder if you have anything to share with people about consuming digital content and anything that they should know about being safe on the internet and just not becoming polarized.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of the high level points I wanted to make. Again, from a social science perspective, I often think about these social forces and how we can protect ourselves against misinformation by having a more diverse set of social identities and not being so dependent on this narrow lens of where we derive our sense of self and how we see ourselves, and just talking to more people and trying to understand their perspectives and where they're coming from. So that's the social element that can protect us against false information online. And then there's the more direct media literacy approach, where we covered a lot of these techniques as far as verifying claims across sources, or what's called lateral reading, and really trying to understand the motivations behind the author and the media outlet they're writing for. And that is more work. I mean, that's one of the challenges, right? Is we're asking people to do more work, which is always a tough sell. And if you don't have this background, it can be even more challenging to evaluate statistics, even just basic statistics, basic ideas of correlation not being causation. I think a lot of these strategies we learn in like a 101 research methods class are so important for evaluating claims online. And I think it's just more important for communicators, science communicators, people interested in media literacy to try to share these techniques and make them as digestible and as fun as they can, so more people will hopefully learn how to better evaluate information they see online and empower themselves to be protected against misinformation.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a good reminder that just because you and I are having this conversation, two people intrigued by this, it's not the reality for everybody. And I think, yes, making it palatable for people to have this information is really important, and not making it more work than it needs to be, especially when so much of our lives are, whether we want it to be or not, online, and we're exposed to a lot of this information. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Thank you again for meeting. And I'm excited to read your book once it comes out. I was so sad when I clicked on the link. I was like, not till later this year.
I know. Yeah, it's coming out. It's a long journey to go through the whole publishing with the university press. So they have peer review process and all that stuff, which is good, but then it also takes a while to finally get it out. But yeah, so it'll be out This summer, at the earliest, early summer, is when I officially will be able to actually give people copies of it to read. So that'll be exciting.
What a great conversation, such an informed and balanced perspective, one that will certainly have me thinking more about education versus moderation. I encourage you to check out Matthew's website, where you'll find his podcast, his research, can follow up on his forthcoming book, and all of that good stuff. And me, I've promised myself to write more, and once I do, you can find it on my Substack at KennyC402, where you might have found this podcast. Anyways, thank you for listening to Social Sleuth. Keep sleuthing.